Haere mai, haere mai ki free kiwis, ko James Kirsten. And today we have a very special guest who is Henare Parata. Welcome.
Kia ora, kōrua.
So Henare, you are a sort of known figure on Twitter or X in the New Zealand policy world, and you also have just been telling me you've been a little bit involved with the Opportunities Party. And I also know that you're a teacher, so you teach mātauranga Māori at a primary school or a high school?
Right.
Right. So, and is that it? I mean, that's a lot already, but do you teach other subjects? Do you?
Yeah, well, that's the broad kind of thing I do. I can get into it a little bit and just explain a bit more about what I do in primary schools.
Yeah. Let's start with that.
That'd be really good. As you probably are aware, there's been a lot of debate about mātauranga Māori in the school curriculum, and it'd be really interesting to get, first of all, your take on that, and also, you know, what for our listeners mātauranga Māori really means.
Okay, so I'll start a bit with a little bit of my background, just so you and listeners know the perspective I'm coming from. So I was born and raised in a rural Māori community, a place called Te Kaha, which is in the Eastern Bay of Plenty, probably about 90% Māori community. Quite deeply immersed in Māori culture, as deep as it can get. We grew up right next to a marae. Māori language was a regular part of our upbringing, Māori culture and all aspects of Māori culture, but also just the practical ways of living in a small Māori community. Things like hunting and fishing and diving and still a bit of living off the land that goes on there. And a lot of old protocol and tikanga are still maintained in places like this. So that's the world I grew up in. And I've lived in Wellington for half of my life as well. So I kind of have this rural, urban Māori, in a way, is quite a unique perspective, I think. And fast forward to today, my main job is I work in mostly primary school communities, where I teach what I'd call mātauranga Māori, which is a whole raft of things. So I teach Māori performing arts, Māori tikanga and protocol. I teach Māori language to students as well as teacher groups. And through that and through teaching Māori performing arts, you also teach things like history. I mean, we learn about important times in New Zealand history, like urbanisation, which I don't think is talked about
right.
as much as it should.
That's kind of the post-World War II era,
right,
when lots of Māori moved from rural areas, especially to South Auckland, but other urban areas as well.
Yeah, it's when all Māori flocked to the cities, and there's a big cultural shift around that time. So we learn about all of these things. So there's a bit of history. I try and teach about things like Māori attitudes and views on certain things, Māori cultural beliefs. I also try and do that in the most objective kind of way, in a way that I'm not, pushing views onto students and stuff as well.
Yeah.
So that's my job. But to answer the question, what mātauranga Māori is, I think that there's a simple answer, and there's probably two ways to answer that. The direct translation is probably Māori knowledge. But I think a better translation, a more accurate translation of mātauranga Māori for me is a Māori cultural perspective. Because mātauranga Māori, when we're talking about mātauranga Māori, it includes a whole plethora of things. It includes all the things I'm talking about. It includes language, protocol, tikanga, history,
hunting and fishing,
everything, the Māori world. And so that's why I think a Māori cultural perspective is a far more accurate.
Yeah, one term I like to use is Maori traditional lore, like LORE, because I think that word can encompass kind of know-how, but also sort of songs and myths and things like that.
Yeah. I think the trouble when we use knowledge It depends what we mean by knowledge. So is it, what do they call it? There's the two kind of perspectives on knowledge. One that includes, a more relativist approach that includes spiritual beliefs, and religion is encapsulated in that. And then there's the more scientific understanding of knowledge.
Yeah,
So I think
so
that's
I guess in the Western mindset, we distinguish knowledge from belief.
right.
And if of course, where all of this got terribly fraught in education is the question of mātauranga Māori and its relationship to science. And of course, as a way of understanding the world, science is very much focused on the objective and finding out, all about the natural world in ways that can be defended with evidence. And I would argue that science became possible because of that split
Mm.
in I guess that started in Europe between understanding of the natural world and then spiritual understanding on the other hand. Whereas I'm not sure that ever was a thing, like that division was ever a thing in Māori world.
No, I agree. I don't think there ever was a division there. It's all part of the same kind of body of cultural understanding. And exactly that's where we've kind of run into trouble, where like the supernatural aspects of mātauranga Māori have been started to be included in things like science class, which is a huge problem.
Yeah.
So do you think there are some aspects of Mātauranga Māori? I mean, we talked about songs and myths; they're also part of Mātauranga Māori. But are there some parts of Mātauranga Māori that are science or something like it? Because people make claims like, well, there's lots of knowledge of local plants, so native plants of New Zealand, and so it could be that Europeans came here and Western scientists didn't know about certain features and certain properties of local plants that sort of Maori traditions knew about. That's one area that people talk about in terms of science and Mātauranga Māori. Another thing that people say a lot is, well, the Polynesians, of course, were great seafarers, and they used the stars and they used the currents, and so that may have been a kind of science. What do you think about those kinds of claims?
Well, on Polynesian navigators and seafarers, I think they're absolutely, even at the time, some of the best seafarers across the globe.
Given the size of their boats, they traveled an incredibly long way and found these tiny little bits of land in a vast ocean. So you've got to say they were pretty good at it.
Right. And I think in the broad sense of science, I think those kinds of things are absolutely science. And things like that, they needed to be pretty accurate. So they needed to be tested. And if they didn't work, people died. They didn't arrive
Right.
at their destination. So they had to be pretty accurate. So I know, I spent a little bit of time on waka haurua, which are the modern interpretations of traditional Polynesian seafaring canoes. And I know a little bit about that world and observed some of the navigators, and they're pretty. I'd consider what they do very scientific. But that's one aspect of mātauranga Māori. When we're talking about mātauranga Māori as a whole and comparing it to science, that's where we run into trouble. But sure, I think there are aspects of mātauranga Māori that I think we could comfortably say is knowledge and is some of it scientific knowledge.
Yeah, you said about those navigational techniques that those were tested, and I'm sure that must be true. I guess I'm a trained scientist, and I guess one of the things about science is that it tests knowledge in a particular way using kind of systematic experiment. And I suppose there's no way to know for sure whether those early Polynesian navigators were using an experimental method or whether it was more trial and error over successive generations where the knowledge was handed down and modified. And if it's that, then perhaps by a strict definition, it's not the same as science. That's not to say that it isn't of equal stature in terms of the achievement. But if you're thinking about putting together a curriculum for school science, it might matter how the knowledge was tested,
Right.
not just that it was
Yeah, it
tested.
brings me back to a traditional philosophical definition of knowledge, which is justified true belief. And Oliver Traldi, who was associated with Heterodox Academy, you know, the American consortium of academics who are in favor of viewpoint diversity and free speech and stuff like that, he wrote an article a while ago because John Haidt, who founded Heterodox Academy, had come out and said, you know, the purpose of the university is truth, and you know, it's a truth-seeking institution. And Oliver Traldi was like, "Oh, I think that's true, but I have a little tweak." And the little tweak was, no, universities are about knowledge, right? And it sounds like a very kind of and not very important nuance, but his point was universities are about instructing students not only about what is true, but about how we arrive at the truth. And so what you really want is to teach them about justified true belief and how you justify belief, how you are able to ascertain that something is a belief is not only true, but also, you know, how you know it's true.
Right.
Yeah. So just to pick up Michael's question then, so is there that element of mātauranga Māori? Is there like methodology in it in terms of empirical investigation?
I don't think it's in a strict scientific sense, but like I said before, in that general sense where there's observation, there's
Yeah.
testing, whether it's over generations through trial and error, like Michael pointed out. There's that element of it, absolutely. I'm not sure if cultures can survive without some level of that.
I agree. There's no
But
culture in the world that hasn't had that, or it wouldn't
Right.
survive. Yeah.
But when you're saying that's comparable to science as a methodology or even as a body of knowledge, it's simply not the same thing.
I did have someone claim to me recently, who wasn't Māori, by the way, and I'd be interested in your take on this, that with some of the agriculture that Māori got into, growing kumara and the like, that they used essentially an experimental approach to figure out where the best spots were to grow kumara and other crops. Do you know anything about that?
Not really. All I know is that in the warmer parts of the country, it grew better, and in the further south you got, it was a bit harder to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen this as a possible reason why there were relatively few Maori in the South Island traditionally, right?
I think that is one of the main reasons.
I think still today it's like 90% of Maori are in the North Island. I mean, most of the population, the total
Most
population
of
is on
New
the North
Zealand's
Island, but like it's
population.
even more extreme with Maori. And I read that was precisely because of kumara and other crops that they brought from the sort of warm waters of the Pacific wouldn't grow in the South Island. At least, you know, once you sort of get beyond sort of Golden Bay and areas like that, the tip of the North Island, it's very difficult to grow them. But Michael, so what you're talking about there is that, because I mean, I know some scientists who would say at this point, well, there's a difference between just trial and error and an experimental method.
Yes, and the claim made to me was that they were indeed using an experimental method with the crops. Now, I'm not sure how we'd know if they were or they weren't, unless there was something written down or handed down some other way. And I haven't seen whatever evidence it is for that myself, but I was wondering if Henare may have more insight into that.
No, not on that particular. Whether they were using an experimental approach when they were growing kumara. No stories off the top of my head.
Yeah.
What I do know is that once potatoes were introduced, Māori adopted the growing of potatoes pretty readily. They grew easier. There was less ceremony and tapu around potatoes, and they kind of took off, along with other introduced sweet potato, other types of kumara as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually an interesting moment in itself, isn't it? Because I mean, we're often told about Maori tradition and how important it is to preserve Maori tradition, and I do think it's important for peoples to preserve their traditions. But that suggests to me that Maori have also always been quite innovative. They've been on the lookout for new things, new crops, new techniques, and when those new crops, new techniques look good, then they eagerly embrace them.
Yeah, they do. And this is one aspect, I think, of the broader subject of colonization that doesn't get talked about much. Is you got to remember in those early times, Māori were the dominant in terms of number.
Yeah,
were the dominant people, and so it wasn't. I mean, if you know much about Māori culture, it wasn't easy to force things on Māori, especially in those times.
Yeah,
they weren't meek people. there to be taken
They've
advantage
never
of.
had that reputation.
No. But, from history, it's pretty clear that Māori consciously adopted a lot of these things. And kumara is just one example.
I guess
When
another would be
you,
literacy, right? Like the reading and writing was picked up pretty eagerly, pretty
yeah,
quickly. Yeah.
And
Oh,
muskets as well. Slightly more controversial example. But I mean, in a way, it shouldn't be controversial, right? Because it's like, most humans across the world in historical times have fought with one another and, fought against their neighbors, basically. And I think, all over the world, when guns were introduced, people, adopted them, and they North American Indians adopted not only guns, but also horses, and they used them against the white man and used them against each other. So it's kind of unsurprising that Maori would eagerly take out muskets as well and guns.
yeah, if you got a score to settle with another tribe, and someone brings along a weapon that's far more effective than something like a taiahawa patu, you're probably gonna take
Yeah,
it up.
I think I remember
It's a
reading in
good,
Michael King's history, like the first battle with muskets. One Maori tribe or Hapu had muskets and the other didn't, and the tribe with muskets actually lost the first battle just because they didn't really know how to use them yet, and they were kind of
right.
trying to set them up and shoot them, and the other guys were just on them at that point and like cut them to pieces.
Yeah,
But ultimately, they worked out how to use them, and of course, they're vastly more effective than traditional spears.
yeah. If you've read anything about Hongi Hika, I think
oh
as a
yes.
young child, he was involved. As a young boy, he was involved in one of the battles, but he was probably attending and helping to carry gear and all this kind of stuff. But he saw his people get slaughtered, and he remembered that as a young boy. And if you know the rest of the history of Hongi Hika, he organizes to get. I think he ended up getting 500 muskets, getting hold of 500 muskets by trading with the king in England, and then pawning that off to someone else in Sydney, and then getting hold of 500 muskets. And he went around and settled all those scores,
Yeah.
old battles that they lost. And early on in those battles, they had to work out distance and things, and so learn how to fight with muskets. They were used to close quarter stuff, and that's when they were. I heard about battles, it might have been that he was involved in, where they lost the battle even though they had more muskets than the other iwi.
Yeah. And you mentioned him trading in Sydney, and that uh, brings to mind another thing that happened very, very early on, probably earlier than most people know, which was that Māori were traveling across the Tasman and doing business in Australia, and were quite entrepreneurial very early on after the English arrived in New Zealand.
Yeah, yeah, sure. They were getting busy pretty early on, and they jumped right into trading. Um, Hongi's story is actually quite fascinating because the planning that it took for him to get to England in the first place
Mm.
and have a plan to get a hold of those muskets by trading goods with the king and then pawning those. It's actually quite fascinating. But they were all doing this around the time, especially in the Bay of Islands there, where contact with Europeans was earlier and more frequent than further down the country.
Yeah.
So I just want to go back to Mātauranga Māori again just for a little bit longer because it's such an interesting conversation, actually. There's such an interesting conversation to be had about science and Indigenous lore. And it's one that I think, obviously, people didn't want us to have, or at least they didn't want us to talk about it in certain ways or to ask certain questions. When the listener letter came out, obviously that got like a huge blowback. But I think, we and also our friend Michael Goldwater on his podcast, Shape of Dialogue, and other people have basically insisted on having this conversation. But one of the things that really interests me about it is that it actually gets us quite quickly into questions about what science is. So this is something that Karl Popper, great Austrian philosopher who lived in New Zealand for 5 or 6 years, was really interested in. And the demarcation problem was just like, what demarcates science from non-science. And so if we go a bit deeper into that, I mean, I know that some people say, even with the navigators or with Maori agriculture, it's not quite science because it was more trial and error. And I think Elizabeth Ratza has argued that it's not science in the case of the navigators because they weren't searching after or looking to discover general rules. So I think for her, a key feature of science is that it promulgates and seeks to
Uh,
falsify these like abstract general
theories.
universal rules.
Theories, in other words. So there's a kind of overarching theory that has explanatory power, and the idea is that the theory will make predictions beyond the case that you're specifically interested in, and
Right.
then you're able to test that theory in other contexts. And this was Karl Popper's great insight, that you can never prove a theory to be true. You can only prove it to be false.
False.
And so the scientist's job is kind of counterintuitive, because they really like their theory, but they've got to try to prove it wrong,
Right.
not prove it right. And that's what scientific training gives us, among many other things, is the understanding that if we think an idea is pretty good, then the best thing we can do is to try to prove it wrong. And to the extent that we fail to prove it wrong, the theory gets stronger.
So basically, you think all swans are white, but then, you can't prove that just by finding more examples of white swans, right? Because there might be non-white swans out there.
Right.
So then if you find one black swan, that disproves the theory. So, yeah. So I guess, again, it sounds like we're beating up on Mātauranga Māori here. I mean, this is kind of the problem with this conversation. It's hard to talk about it without sounding like you're saying one culture is better than another. But I don't think that we know of any kind of body of Mātauranga Māori that was interested in promulgating general laws. I mean, do you agree with that? Are we missing something as Pākehā?
I haven't come across something.
Yeah.
No.
And just to say something about that, I think that's been one of the obstacles to having the debate properly, is the kind of sense that people are saying the scientific worldview is superior in some way. And look, my view would be it's probably the most powerful method ever discovered for refining knowledge. But that isn't the whole story, because,
Right.
like I said before, in order for it to become possible, we had to divorce the kind of rational mind from the religious or spiritual mind, and that had a huge cost. And so it would be a mistake to say that just because we have a scientific worldview, that makes the culture as a whole better. I don't think that's true. I think it became really good at some things and really quite stupid in other ways.
It's very good for things like medicine and technology.
Yeah.
But then this is why so many white people then have to have dreadlocks and move to Golden Bay and become hippies. They're looking for something spiritual, right?
Right. It kind of, and people like Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, were talking about the death of God, and he wasn't happy about it, even though he was an atheist, because he thought it just left this big hole in people that was going to be filled by something, and it probably wasn't going to be good. And then we saw that in the 20th century with Nazism and other forms of totalitarian ideology that took hold. And so I think we can get beyond the question about which culture is better or not as good or whatever, and have a better conversation about differences and what we can learn from one another.
Yeah, totally agree. I think it kind of leads into something I think about a bit, where when you're comparing cultures and which is better and which it isn't, there's a lot of reinventing of what Māori pre-colonial culture was like, and I find there's a lot of if it's not, at best it's romanticizing it a bit, but at worst it's just completely fabricating it. It's just
Can you elaborate on that a bit, Henare?
Yeah, well, there's a general narrative that pre-colonial Māori society was a utopian paradise, where, and if only we could tap into those secrets of this indigenous wisdom, all our problems today could be solved. And of course, for me, that's just a gross misunderstanding of history. But I think some people feel bad about how New Zealand history has played out, and this is one way they resolve it, is to pretend it was pre-colonial Māori history was better than it was. The pre-colonial Māori society was pretty brutal, by any measure. By today's measure, absolutely. But even at the time, I mean, things like cannibalism and human sacrifice and infanticide and these
Slavery.
things. Slavery happened quite a regular part of everyday life. The answer to that is not to pretend that didn't happen. It's to acknowledge the reality of that. I mean, the truth. Truth is the first thing. That's the truth of our history. That doesn't justify, this is where people can't reconcile it. That doesn't justify historical injustices that Māori have suffered, and land theft and all that.
Yeah.
Land disposition.
Yeah.
That doesn't justify that, but people can't reconcile that. It has to be beautiful, and then the fact that colonizers came and took over makes it bad.
I think we got this a lot in the culture wars, that I think that, so something was used, so the worst of the colonizers went really over the top and used this whole idea, like Maori are savages, native people are savages, we can do to them whatever we want. We're justified because we're superior civilization, right? I don't think all the colonists were even like that. I mean, I think probably most of them weren't. Probably some of them had views which would be considered racist nowadays, but they probably weren't sort of complete white supremacists.
There's no doubt a lot of racism, but
also like a lot of cooperation back in the day as well. We shouldn't have lied that. But I think because that was the way people talked about native peoples for so long, that completely discredited any talk that sort of vaguely sounds like that. But to say as a historian, like, Paul Moon wrote a book about cannibalism, and we talked to him on this podcast about cannibalism, and he was very kind of evidence-based and clear-cut. He wasn't sort of ranting about it. He was just saying there is historical evidence that Maori engaged in this practice, which we know that other people in the Pacific and other areas of the world engaged in at certain historical moments.
In fact, if you go back far enough in European history, you find a bit of it too, and all the other things that you mentioned, Henare, infanticide and slavery and so on.
There's a book about whether there was human sacrifice in early Greece, Homo necans by Walter Burkhardt. So we don't think of the ancient Greeks as engaging in these kinds of practices, but like a lot of people early on in their development.
Well, they certainly practiced infanticide, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. And then if you read Tom Holland's recent book Dominion about the history of Christianity, one of the things that he stresses, he thinks is like most characteristic of Christianity, is precisely that they rejected infanticide. This whole idea of like exposing unwanted children was kind of anathema in the Christian world in a way it hadn't been in the pagan world. But anyway, it's very interesting. Like, I think there's so many different things, so many different elements to this utopian image of pre-colonial Maori society. But like one of the very striking ones is that it's meant to have been like completely peaceful, right? They all sort of sat around and just, like
grew kumara and sang songs.
They sang songs, and we have this a lot with the legal system. People say we need to adopt Maori tikanga because they had ways of resolving disputes that were much more peaceful. And maybe they did within Hapu. I don't know, but it strikes me that you have to admit that they were a very warlike society. And indeed, there's this weird contradiction because people at the university always tell you, oh, the Maori, they resolve disputes in this wonderful manner. They weren't like us. We're sort of aggressive colonizers in the West. We always make war. But at the same time, Maori were also fierce warriors, and we have to respect that. So I always kind of think, well, which is it? Like, were they fierce warriors or were they incredibly peace-loving? And were they all hippies?
Yeah, there were some interesting ways they resolved conflict, like donk on the head sometimes. I mean,
it resolves the conflict,
Yeah,
actually, it usually doesn't, because the guy usually wakes up and then wants to donk the other guy back on the head. So,
And I mean, when you talk about the reality of how that world was, I mean, people normally dismiss that as you've been colonized. You're coming from a colonizer's perspective. I mean, I get that at least 3 times a day, kind of thing. But it's yes, you're going to find this in history books like Paul Moon's book you talked about, and anyone who studied history. But this is also handed down through traditional Māori means too. So you find these same stories in Waiata and Haka.
About cannibalism.
About all the stuff I talked about. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, really? And people still sing those songs today? They pass them down?
Well, that's the way information was passed on. Eh?
I'm assuming they're not saying this is a good idea, but it's interesting.
No, but there are plenty of songs that, I mean, we grew up singing a lot of these songs and performing these haka that talk about these old battles and incidences of, all the colourful stuff we just talked about.
Just to complicate the story a bit more as well, it seems to me sometimes that colonization did make some of that stuff a whole lot worse. I mean, we were talking about muskets before, and probably before there were muskets, you know, a couple of hapu or iwi could have a battle, and some people might be badly injured or even killed, but by and large, not huge casualties. But you start to bring muskets into the picture, and then, you know, I think history tells us that a major proportion of the Māori population were wiped out by those wars. And arguably as well, maybe some of the other things, I don't have any knowledge here, and you'd be able to fill it in, but maybe things like slavery were made worse just because some tribes then became more dominant.
Right.
And they were then able to dominate more people through their warlike abilities and take more slaves and so on. So that's something, I mean, I'm sure that the colonizers didn't intend to do, but it was still a result of colonization.
Yeah, I mean, if those are the colonizers who wanted these natives to start killing each other, that would have worked out really good for them.
Yeah.
I think also
because they did. It made you know, put feuds between tribes that were you know, with relatively few casualties. It put this whole thing on cocaine. You know, it really ramped up. And of course, if you know the history of the Māori people, Māori from, I think, Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Mutunga, who ended up here in Wellington, they grabbed a ship that was parked in the harbour here. I'm not sure off the top of my head how they got it, but then they travelled to the Chathams and slaughtered them.
Yeah.
So that made, yes, I mean, even the distances you could travel to attack another tribe.
I was going to say, if it was a British ship, you know, a sailing ship, probably, you know, they could transport more people more quickly to the Chathams than they could have in more traditional vessels. In fact, at some point, the Māori kind of gave up long distance seafaring, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what date, but once, you know, the ancestors of Māori settled here, I don't think it was very long before you know, the seafaring canoes kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Because they had a new home. There was no need to keep going.
Why would you go to a tiny little island, you know, thousands
Right.
of kilometers away if you've got these two great, you know, islands with lots of resources on them?
Yep.
The Maori tradition does preserve memories of the Waka arriving, right? Because a lot of iwi trace their lineages back to Waka, but I don't know if they retain any other memory of seafaring across the Pacific. Like they don't pass down knowledge of other Pacific islands, do they?
Not that I know of. And in fact, Polynesians in general had mostly forgotten long distance seafaring, and it had to be rediscovered by visiting Micronesian people who were still actually doing that. And it was an island, I think, called Satawal, where they might have had one main navigator left, a guy named Mau Piailuk, who navigated, and they, you know, traversed the seas around their islands using stars and traditional methods like that.
Yeah.
So the Hawaiians actually went to Micronesia to relearn this stuff, I think, in the 80s. And that then spread out amongst other Polynesian groups, including Māori. And there's a bit of a sad irony that I think now the Micronesians have forgotten
Right.
seafaring, and Polynesians are going back and teaching them.
Right.
So it just also shows that once something, you know, when a better technology comes along, where you can go fishing without needing to follow the stars and all this kind of stuff and sail, people adopt it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The Moriori may well have been more pacifistic than a lot of people's. I mean, if you read Jared Diamond's classic Guns, Germs, and Steel, he has a really interesting chapter which focuses on the Moriori and what happened to them. And what he suggests is that they actually kind of unlearned the agriculture because they were originally Maori as well. Of course, they came from mainland New Zealand, and then they actually went back to sort of pasturage and fishing. And he suggests that for that reason, their social structure was a lot more cohesive, and was a much smaller place, and so they weren't in the habit of fighting against each other so much, and that's why they were especially vulnerable when Maori made it from the mainland. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while since I learned about Moriori, but I know when we were at university, the orthodox theory was actually that they were a separate group that came from East Polynesia, straight to the Chathams, and there might have been some intermarrying with Ngāi Tahu Māori a little bit later. Might have been like a second wave there.
All right, I didn't know that.
But
Okay.
yeah, and the
Interesting.
Moriori thing is another thing that pops up quite a lot, where I actually feel sorry for the Moriori because I'm not sure their story has been told accurately on both sides of
Right.
the debate.
That's right. Yeah. Well, because there's the myth of before Maori were in mainland New Zealand, there were Moriori, and that doesn't seem to be true. There's no evidence for that. I don't
No,
think.
there's no evidence for that at all,
Yeah.
and that was
No.
debunked a long time ago.
Yeah.
But
On the
people still debate that as if that's the main debate. But I think,
Yeah.
most educated people on the subject know that that was never the case,
on
and
a
it was a way for people to justify colonization of Māori.
right, because they'd done it themselves to the
They've done it
Moriori.
themselves.
Yeah.
But
On a
the
kind of
important part is this is the next part that gets forgotten, is the part where Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Mutunga go there and pretty much commit genocide against them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that did happen. So that's why I think I've met some people in Wellington, like some students who sort of said, "Oh no, that didn't happen." And I think that they're mistaking that episode,
Exactly.
a minor episode, but it still really happened. It wasn't so minor for the Moriori. They're confusing that with this idea that Moriori were all over New Zealand and they got, taken out by the Maori.
exterminated. Yeah.
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 Yeah. On the theme of the way in which conflict changed over time, I remember reading a long, long time ago now, like 30 years. So my memory is very hazy, and I'd be interested to see if you've got any reflections on this. I can't even remember the book, but they made the claim that after the moa were hunted to extinction, Māori became a lot more warlike, and because food was scarcer, and so then that led to more intertribal conflict because they were basically starving. And the evidence that they put up, as I recall, and I may be misremembering here, was that the carvings changed and they became a lot more warlike in their visages when they made carvings of faces, that they had more warlike expressions. Do you know anything about that?
No, not off the top of my head.
I mean,
But,
it could be one of these other canards that gets into
be.
I think that there's, I think that's, I got this, I mean, I've only read like introductory books about New Zealand history, but I got the sense that idea that there was like a moa hunting phase of Maori civilization when sort of living was easy. And they were just driving moa down into these river valleys where we have actually, there's archaeological sites in Canterbury, I think, where they just found loads of moa bones. And they were just slaughtering these things, which didn't have any fear really. So that's one phase. And then you move to, I think it's sometimes called like the classical Maori world, where I think you can also see archaeologically that they're starting to build pas, like they're starting to fortify their villages and stuff, which they hadn't done before. And so, yeah, that's when you get more scarcity and they're kind of competing in that way.
I mean, it makes sense because it's true all over the world that scarcity leads to a conflict, right?
Yeah, and there's similar stories that people have told about Easter Island, but that's like really controversial what went down there because there's just so little that we know about.
There's no evidence to
yeah.
speak of apart from the big stone heads.
There's stories that are handed down, even Māori stories that are passed down through these traditional means, through psalm and haka and things. They go back to, there's a lot of stories about when Māori ancestors left the islands, and there's a lot of conflict stories around those times. Killing of chief's son, the stealing of breadfruit, from the chief's garden. These kinds of incidents. There's a fishing incident out at sea where one of the brothers, who was the low-born brother, wanted to kill his older brothers so he could have, be the top dog kind of stuff. So there's a lot of these incidences. So it sounds like even if we go that far back in East Polynesia,
yeah,
there's incidences of probably population growth competing for resources, and then conflicts start arising, and then someone has to leave.
When you talk about those stories, I'm interested in how you think about them, because what I'm thinking is, again, if we look at kind of Western culture, there's a sort of split between history where we talk about, the past in an evidence-based way and try to gather archaeological evidence and archival evidence and so on to debate about what happened and why those things happened. And then more mythological backgrounds, and you could think about the Old Testament of the Bible, for example, that, you know, purports to be the history of the Jewish people, but actually, you know, a lot of it is probably story, maybe based in something that happened and maybe not, but its primary purpose is to convey some kind of morality or lessons for us, uh, as opposed to be an accurate depiction of the past. And if again in Mātauranga Māori there isn't a real distinction between those two things, how do you think about that?
No, I don't think there is a distinction. I think it's all kind of delivered as story for you to consume how you like.
Right, but for yourself as a Māori person living in the 21st century,
right,
exposed to, you know, both cultures, how do you think about that difference when you think about the Māori past and the stories? You know,
it depends. It depends what story. Like, so things like the story of Maui fishing up the island, for example, that's clearly a fable.
Yeah.
But people argue that there's some kind of grain of truth to that. And I'll give you an example. So the idea of Maui fishing this island out of the sea, it's explained by navigators, for example, that when you're on a waka and you're going over the horizon, you see on the horizon land starts to appear. Well, your navigator, who Maui was meant to be, in stories he's a navigator.
Yeah.
He's standing at the front of this waka, telling the crew where to go and direction and stuff. And so it can be a metaphor that he's kind of pulling this island as it starts emerging out of the sea. The highest peaks of the land start popping up out of the sea. It is like he's fishing it out. So could it be a metaphor? Yep, I think, and there are examples where it is a metaphor. I think there are other examples where it's just clearly a story to teach kids about morals, like things about Donna and the moon, for example, where Donna is captured by the moon. And then there are things like Polynesian history, before the ancestors of the Māori arrived here, that seem to have some elements of truth in it, because you get a kind of a historical corroboration going on. Like another iwi over here might have a story where one of the details is a little bit different, and the peculiar details that clash kind of give it some credence.
Right.
It's something about this fishing trip must have happened. There must have been some kind of fishing trip.
Right.
So you can take elements of that.
And I guess the way in which it evolves over time might have to do with the meaning that people get from it. And I'm really interested in the way the mythologies of the world kind of converge on similar stories. If you compare the ancient Greek creation myth with the Māori one, it's very, very similar, even though those peoples never had any contact. And I find that sends shivers down my spine, because I think, wow, there's something so deep in us that is unified through story. And I guess, I'm a bit of a Jungian, a fan of Carl Jung, who looked into these kinds of confluences of story around the world and saw some symbolic truth in it very, very deeply.
Mm.
Yeah, and that story about Maui I particularly love, because what most New Zealanders would know the story, and they know that he fished up the North Island to Eka Maui, but what perhaps fewer people know is that he did it with the jawbone of one of his ancestors, right, as a fish hook. And I think about that as like the jawbone is what we speak with. But it's in that case it was dead because it was a bone, right, and it was from his dead ancestor. But then, if I understand correctly, he actually cut himself with it and put blood on it as bait.
Well, he punched his nose is one of the other versions.
Right. So, and blood is like life force. So he kind of was invigorating this dead thing with his own life force, and then casting it into the sea, which is pretty universally a symbol of chaos. And with it, he drew up land, which is a symbol of order. And so it's like by invigorating the culture of our ancestors or the speech of our ancestors with our own life force, we're able to draw order out of chaos. And, who knows what is meant by it really, but I find that interpretation very powerful.
Yeah, agree.
Can I ask about, so I'm interested in this whole thing. You raised a really big topic with this whole idea of like what pre-colonial Maori civilization was like and how, whether it was this utopia. Like another aspect that's very sort of salient in the culture wars is this whole idea that pre-colonial Maori civilization was sort of gender fluid, right? And not only that, but it was like a sexual utopia. So this kind of goes back to the Margaret Mead stuff about Samoa, like the idea that Polynesians are just very sex positive, and it's like then the European Christians came and they had all these hang-ups about sex, and also they kind of they got rid of all the gay people and they kind of rigidly ordered people into this binary, and maybe in reality, before the European Christians came, everything was more fluid. I don't want to sort of you can probably tell from the actually I was going to say you can tell from the tone of my voice. My voice basically has no tone, but I am like a little bit suspicious of the story, but I don't want to be too cynical about it because I do think that this is one aspect that I think might have something in it. Like I think that the sort of modern progressive view goes a bit far, but I do know, for example, like I've traveled a bit in the Pacific Islands, and I will say like there's a much higher rate of transvesticism or transsexuality in places like Samoa than anywhere else I've been, maybe with the exception of like Bangkok or something. But like,
Yeah.
there's definitely a subculture of that there, and I don't really understand why. So, what do you think about that? Like, do you get the sense that before the Europeans came, the Maori were you kind of more open to different types of gender expression and different sexualities, or is that also just sort of made up?
Uh, to be blunt, I don't know enough about that area, and I've looked at a little bit of the argument. And to be honest, one of the arguments I find quite compelling on the side of that actual argument is I think it might have been Elizabeth Kirekire's research that found that one of the missionaries in one of the communities had relationships with some of the men in the village, but it was something that just wasn't talked about. And it wasn't talked about too much. Like I don't know too many Māori stories that talk about transgenderism at all. So that either means it could mean two things. It could mean that it was normalized and it just wasn't worth talking about, or it was very rare and didn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'm not sure what the answer is, to be honest.
I think if we think about just the category of homosexuality, and James, you'll be able to comment here on ancient Greece, where sexual relationships between older men and younger men were very common, up to the point where the younger man started to develop a beard, and then it became a bit strange if he kept doing it after that.
Yeah.
But they didn't think of it as homosexual or gay in the way that we now have a category of person who identifies as being homosexual.
Yeah, I think that a lot of scholars would say that now. That was the sort of norm that, a citizen male in Athens would almost certainly be married after a certain point, but he'd also be able to, have dalliances with flute girls and with female prostitutes. But also these pederastic relationships were some of the deepest emotionally probably in most citizen males' lives because they were held with other citizens who were probably reasonably well educated, even though they were younger. Yeah, I have to always say this when I used to teach this subject. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that's probably how it was in history.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like you were either gay or not. Like it wasn't like we have all these knowledge of all these Athenian guys who like never got married and they were just going out with other guys. We know about like we have information about some couples that seemed male couples that seemed to have been especially closely bonded. So one example is Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who were called the tyrant slayers, and the Athenians actually had statues of them in the Agora because the story was that they killed Hippias, the last tyrant of Athens, together. And Zeno and Parmenides, the philosophers, they were meant to be a couple as well. So we do have some information about couples who were like, going steady. But yeah, most of these guys would have been married as well.
And so I guess, this might be also in favor of the progressive idea about indigenous cultures or a lot of cultures of the past, which is that they just didn't categorize things in quite the same way. But on the other side of it, they did have some pretty strict moral laws and prescriptions. And
Yeah.
Again, one of my other understandings from the ancient world is the Romans, they would also have homosexual sex, and that was all right as long as you were the one doing the penetrating. But if you were the
Right.
one taking it, that was not so good.
That's something that we find in Greece as well. Yeah,
Right.
with the Romans there is some pederasty, but it's seen as a little bit foreign in Greece, in Greek and effeminate, and it's sort of among aristocrats it's kind of a thing because the Roman aristocracy, certain segments of the Roman aristocracy are very kind of interested in Greek culture, and so Horace has a few poems about boys basically in a sort of sexual romantic setting. But
But
that thing about being penetrated, yeah, that was a huge thing in ancient Greece, and we actually have like a trial where somebody is they try and actually take his citizenship away, because he's been a male prostitute and he's let somebody anally penetrate him, which wasn't sort of the done thing. Anyway, we're getting very far from
We
Ao Maori, but yeah. I, so
I
Pre-Kiwi
think
is always
sometimes that argument is taken to also argue that Māori society was egalitarian, and then genders, men
yeah,
and women kind of, and that's just simply not the case. There were clearly defined roles,
right.
which you find in most cultures that need to do physical labor to survive and this kind of thing. People
Or
settle
that are
into roles
warlike,
pretty
right?
quickly. Yeah.
yeah. So what's your experience been of that? Because I'm also interested in this topic of who gets to speak at the marae and at meetings at Hui, because I think when I first came to New Zealand, there was some kind of controversy about in a university. They had some kind of meeting in a marae, and the women were asked to go to the back, and there were some non-Maori women from other countries who were a bit, justifiably cheesed off about this. So is that sort of invariably a thing? And also, I think I read an article a while back. I think it was in the newsroom about women speakers, and this article was obviously, I might have even been on the spinoff. It was written by someone who's obviously progressive, trying to say, look at all these examples of women who've spoken in public in a traditional Maori setting. And I kind of read the article. I sort of thought, okay, there's like 3 or 4 examples over
Yeah,
the
there are
past
3 or
100
4.
years.
Exactly.
So to me, I came away with the conclusion
I can
actually.
name them, so that's how few there
Yeah.
are.
So that's been your experience too, that like traditional Maori settings, they're quite patriarchal, really.
Yeah, well, like on most marae, men practice oratory and women aren't permitted to. And there's all these arguments that people use to justify that. It's the women get their say during the karanga, for example, which is the ceremonial calling before,
Very, very beautiful thing.
right? They're not, anyway, all the justifications aren't very well grounded.
Right.
I've been pretty vocal against this. Again, it's trying to reconcile and trying to bring together. If we're going to include Māori protocol in any way in broader New Zealand society, you have to have these arguments and you have to work out where it's going to fit. Now, you're never really going to bring this particular tikanga into mainstream society because it rubs up against things like basic human rights and gender equality and things like that. And those are going to conflict. So you've got to resolve that. And I think the only way to resolve that is for Māori to have a good think about that and change it, and just change it.
And that's the sign of a living culture, right? Like,
right.
There's no culture that doesn't change over time unless it's a dead culture.
To me, what you're saying there, it sounds like you're actually a Maori progressive, right? This is the weird thing, that somehow the extreme progressive position that's popular at universities is almost to sort of honor the tradition. It's almost like an extreme conservative position. We have to like retain the tradition almost
at the extent that it wants Māori culture to be a museum piece that is like it was before the colonists came.
Exactly. And there's a similar argument with including things like karakia, for example, in a mainstream setting.
Yeah.
And I've tried to look at ways that we could possibly include that, because we get to decide as New Zealanders what our culture is going to be like, and we can include these things if we want, or we can throw them out. And I think there are examples where I think if we could have it both ways. We could include Māori culture in a way that also doesn't breach things like secularism, for example.
Right.
And so a similar argument is happening there with the inclusion of karakia in council meetings. I think it flares up quite a bit. And people, I think rightly, in a lot of cases, don't want to participate in those things.
Well, as a non-Māori New Zealander, I can say that when I've been on a marae or in another setting where there was a sort of strong iwi, traditional iwi presence, I find the karakia and the waiata and all of the ceremony welcoming and beautiful and entirely appropriate.
Right.
When it's adopted by an institution in a way that's either a what we might call a virtue signal or as a kind of ideological weapon, if it feels as if it's like just being rolled out to put people in their place, then I don't like it.
Mm. And it has been used like that quite a lot.
Yeah.
I even think there's this thing of like sort of Maori washing at universities where you like rename the senior management team Tehiwa or something, and it sort of signals virtue. And you do that just at the time where you're also like passing this brutal series of cuts, which is botched in various ways. But anyway, that's just a theory.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So okay, I think that obviously, we're probably going to get stick for just talking about this, but I also think, maybe we've been too negative about Te Ao Maori culture, or whatever. So I just want at the end, like I want to know. So maybe you could just speak about. You teach Mātauranga Maori, so you've been talking a lot about how if there are things that we don't like as New Zealanders or as Maori, we can get rid of them. I totally agree. But what are the elements in traditional Maori culture that you really enjoy teaching and that you really think are beautiful and interesting? And people who maybe think, oh, all of that, all the traditional Maori culture is just rubbish. What would you say to them? Like, what do you think is especially valuable?
Well, I think, Māori history, even pre-colonial history, it's part of New Zealand history. So it's a really important part, I think. I personally find it interesting, but I think beyond that, I think it's an important thing that everyone should understand.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot of aspects I enjoy, and I'm not so naive to think because I enjoy something, I'm going to shove it down everyone else's throat. You're going to enjoy it too. But I think there are some things that are from Māori culture that could be objectively beneficial for a lot of people. I mean, they're quite subtle things. Like in my community, it's still pretty normal when people go fishing or hunting and things to then once they get home, food is dropped off at different houses around the community, and especially for older people who can't go fishing and things themselves. I think these are beautiful aspects of Māori culture
Mm.
that I think could be adopted in suburbs.
Right. I mean
But there's plenty of
that
examples. That's just one off the top of my head.
it's a nice one because, one of the things about living in cities, big cities, is that people get more alienated from one another and the
Right?
community starts to break down, especially I think in the last 20, 30 years when we have fewer uh, social institutions that people participate in on a large scale, whether that's churches or sports clubs or whatever. It feels like things are getting more atomized. And if we did have a tradition like that, where, if you have some good luck or something comes your way, you share it with the people around you, that would help to redress that, right?
Yeah. Well, they talk about social cohesion being a big problem these days, and I
Yeah.
totally agree. And so we've got to look at ways to bring people a bit closer together.
Do you have favorite waiata or like marae that you think are particularly beautifully carved or things like that?
Oh, you're asking someone from Te Whānau, so I'm going to always just, as most Māori will talk about their own marae and stuff, I think. My marae was carved, I think. Apira Nangata organised the carving of it. Actually, he organised the carving of wharenui all across the country, but especially around the East Coast area, as a way of keeping culture alive. And so I think our wharenui was built during World War II or was completed around that time.
Mhm.
And it's a beautifully carved wharenui.
Sorry, where is it exactly?
Eastern Bay of Plenty, a small place called Te Kaha, which is just outside of Opotiki.
Very nice. I haven't been to that area of the country yet, but I hope to get there. Um, I've been to, I guess the closest I've been is like Wairua and Lake Waikamoana. And
Oh, you're right. That's a
I've
bit
been up
further away.
that highway, which still partly unsealed, right? You go from there through the
Yeah,
forests and you get to Rotorua eventually. It's a very interesting part of the country, actually. You can definitely see like the old Maori tradition still going.
Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for coming on our podcast and sharing your knowledge of Mātauranga Māori and Te Ao Māori. And yeah, best of luck with everything.
It's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you, Henare.
Kia ora koutou.